Hello everyone, and welcome to this new episode of Street Talk. Street Talk, as you may already know, is the Urban Violence Research Network's new series of interviews. In these interviews, we, of course, interview members and non-members, but in general, experts who study topics of urban violence, of course, and also related topics such as organized crime and police violence. So in this new episode, we're going to speak about recent protests that have rocked Italy a few weeks ago. And to some measure, they're still ongoing. So a few weeks ago, Italy started enacting stricter anti-lockdown, anti-pandemic measures. And these measures were actually met with a fierce backlash from the streets. This kind of backlash is not very common in Italy. It became very apparent very soon, and a lot of videos were shared about what was happening in the streets. Now, to speak about these unrest, we have here a member of our network and a contributor of our blog. He wrote for us a blog piece back in May regarding the role of mafias in the current COVID pandemic in Italy. So I'm pleased to welcome Luciano Pollichieni to Street Talk. So Luciano, welcome.
Hi, Andrea. Thank you for having me.
Luciano Pollichieni is a doctoral researcher at the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham, and his PhD project on Islamist mafias investigates the phenomenon of the crime-terror nexus with a special focus on the activities of Al-Qaeda on the Islamic Maghreb and the Haqqani network. Now, this is actually a very interesting topic, so I would like to have you for a conversation about your PhD topic, because I think there's going to be a lot of things, like a lot of very interesting and fascinating things that you...
Don't disappoint you, man.
Oh, well, man, I'm hoping so. And by the way, as you probably have already noticed, like this is all Italian lineup to speak about Italy. You know,
I was thinking about that. It's like two Italians speaking in English. It's like an example of bad English and provincialism at the same time.
I know, right? Well, we don't want to disappoint our audience as well. And we'll have a lot of explaining to our friends that they have to watch a video on Italy by two Italians, but in English. But you know, that's the international nature of academia for you. So as Luciano already contributed to our blog Word on the Street with an article on mafias and COVID-19 and potential unrest, it was just natural that we invited him to speak about the recent unrest regarding anti-pandemic measures in Italy. So first thing that I want to ask you, Luciano, is maybe to just tell us a little bit about the urban unrest that has happened in Italy and how it happened and why it's important. So the word is to you, Luciano.
Okay, thank you. So what happened is quite simple. On the night between the 23rd and 24th of October, last October, a great mass demonstration took place in Naples, and it was composed by a wide range of different subjects. We're contesting the new restrictive measures concerning the COVID pandemic in Italy. It was a really great crowd made of shopkeepers, employees in the tourism sector, and also far-right elements or no-mask people, also believers of the plot theories on the pandemic that unfortunately we got familiar with during the ongoing pandemic. And the aim of this protest were to contest the economic damages that were brought by the new restrictive measures, which is a dynamic which is quite common among different countries in Europe and the rest of the world. And at some point during this demonstration, the crowd split in two different fields, into different wings of this demonstration. The first one was peaceful, and it was mainly one of the shopkeepers, factory workers. After they physically and metaphorically contest the curfew imposed at midnight by the local authorities, they finished their demonstration and they went back home. Another wing of this demonstration took the streets and started to clash with local police forces. And at the end of this arrest, we have some tens of thousands of euro of damages. Demonstrators attack police vehicles, and also they brought a lot of damage to the local street furnitures. And what is interesting to see is that apart from the demonstration strictly located in Naples, is that in the days after the first demonstration in Naples, we have seen similar unrest in Milan, in Turin, in Sicily, where up to date we do have the same kind of demonstrations and arrests in Catania, Palermo, and Syracuse. And these different demonstrations have replied the same dynamics, but with different compositions. So for instance, there are no evidences of the presence of the far left in the streets of Naples, but we have seen that there was a presence of far left extremists in the city of Turin. So as you can see, it's a sort of modus operandi that has replicated across Italy. The main objective of these unrest is to contest the lockdown measures and the restrictions related to the pandemic. And even if politically it doesn't change that much, these sort of popular unrest and this popular demonstration have nevertheless brought to a deep sense of insecurity and of danger among the Italians and the Italian government as well, which is now facing not only the medical emergency, but also the emergency related to the unrest and to these social tensions in the country.
And as you mentioned, there have been like protests all over the country. But the first one was in Naples. Now, is it important that it started in Naples and not in other cities? And why did it start in Naples and not, for example, in Rome or Milan or Turin or other cities around the country?
That's a very interesting question, which unfortunately brought to a sad answer. So yeah, it does, in the history of Italy, it has Naples or unrest in Naples have an historical relevance. So for instance, the city was the first Italian metropolitan cities to revolt against the Nazi in the Second World War. And ideally, to some historians, that was the beginning of the Italian resistance to fascism and Nazism. So of course, when such things happen in Naples, they can have a sort of historical relevance in the aftermath, and they can produce some important influences for the country as a whole. Considering why happened in Naples, and this is a really good question to ask. Now, I believe that the pandemic, the current pandemic in Italy as elsewhere, has not that much created some new dynamics in the street violence or in political activism, but it has more exasperated something that was already there. So Naples today is since 2008, the economic crisis of 2008, the things have worsened, but you need to understand that in general, the situation in the south of Italy is characterized by a strong level of unemployment, 16.2% of unemployment, which is affecting mainly the youth and women in the south of the country, with a 23.3 unemployment rate in the city of Naples. Now, the paradox is that through, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, through the exploitation in some ways of the tourism sector and the exploitation of what is called the touristic industry, the city of Naples has in the last years recorded some level of economic development. So an interesting data to see, for instance, is how the real estate market in Naples, in terms of values, it has growth of 2% in the last 2 years. While, for instance, I know it sounds a paradox, but the city of Rome, in the city of Rome, the real estate market is completely flat, is frozen. And so the idea of tourism, the use of tourism has been a remarkable tool for economic development, and tool to fight youth unemployment especially. Now, there are two problems which are interesting from our perspective concerning this sort of economic model. The first one is that the economic development in the south of Italy, especially in the south of Italy, is what I call a street-based economic system. So everything you see from an economic perspective in the big cities in Italy, legal or illegal economy, is very related to what happened in the streets. Needless to say, when you have a lockdown, the street become empty. And so both the economic crisis, the legal and the legal one, they suffer very much. And this is the same thing. It's pretty evident in big cities like Naples. But for instance, I grew up in Reggio Calabria, which is a smaller city in comparison to Naples. But even in that case, the economic system is really street-based. So everything happens in the street. People meet in the street, they buy in the street, they sell in the street. And this sort of the dark side of this even positive for some aspects economic model is that there is in Naples, as in the south elsewhere, but also in Italy, it's a big problem, a strong level of underground economy and illegal employment. Now, what that produces in the case of a pandemic, if you are illegal and employed, if you have underground economy, so if you're not well settled with your tax incomes and you haven't talked with the state and you haven't give proofs of your truth level of incomes, in this specific moment, so the one of the pandemic, you completely cut from every form of economic support or benefits that the state can allow to you. So right now, you do have these remarkable amounts of workers in Naples, in the south, in Italy in general, who are completely cut out from every form of economic benefit or any form of economic subsidy from the state. The only, and this is the thing that I had the opportunity to vote for what are doing the streets, the only sort of welfare these people can achieve and the only sort of welfare these people can receive is the one of the illegal criminal organization, so is the one of the Camorra. This situation, this illegal economy, this illegal employment has brought to a dramatic increase in social tension, which is eventually exploded in Naples that time. And it is exploded in Naples because, as you know, we as scholars in politics, we know that the 50% of nowadays politics, well, even more than 50%, let's say the 70, 80%, it is about communication. What happened in the 21st or 22nd of October, so the day before the revolts and the unrest, it happens that the local president of the region of Naples, Campania, he said, without any previous consultation with the other parts, the employers, the entrepreneurs of the city, he said, I'm going to ask for a complete lockdown, the same one that the country has experienced in March 2020. And consequently, this has brought this has increased a strong level of hostility against local government. And unfortunately, the situation became explosive. And at that point, it happened that this very violent arrest took place in Naples. So I think that Naples is in some way in the middle of these different dynamics. Remarkable presence of organized crime, illegal economy, economic crisis, unemployment, and of course, the kind of social categories which are affected by unemployment and crisis, which are mainly the youth. So if you remember, it's very, I know I'm there in saying this, but it's very a dynamic which is very similar to the Arab Springs or to other unrests in the world. When the youth is the part of the population which is most suffering from an economic crisis, it's easier to take the streets, it's easier to have this kind of arrests. And this is what happened in Naples. We don't know if this kind of arrests will have a strong influence, a decisive influence in the sort of the countries facing new restrictions, but it's definitely something we should look, and it's definitely something we should care about, also because of historical precedents.
Absolutely. There is so much to unpack, and just to start and just to clarify maybe to our viewers. So mm, the unrest and the protests were equally aimed at the central government, who had just enacted some strict anti-pandemic measures. They are short of lockdown still to this point, but they were already starting to get it was already a signal towards stricter measures. So it was equally against the central government and against the local government. And just to clarify to our viewers, Italy is not a federal state. So the regional governments, which would be basically akin to state governments in the United States or in Germany, regional governments don't have don't have public security powers. They do manage health. So now in Italy, it's a pretty confusing situation in which the regions have actually the jurisdiction over health matters, but then public security is in the hands of the central government. So everything comes out of a lengthy and difficult negotiation between center and local powers. So if I'm not mistaken, the arrest was equally directed towards central government and regional government. And if I'm not mistaken,
Yes, it is.
the arrest was asking for subsidies. So a good, like a sizable part of the protesters in Naples and in other cities, they were asking for economic help.
Yes, exactly. And the main motto used by protesters was, "You are shutting us down, you are going to pay us." And in the day after, even if on a lower level of violence, there were some unrest against with some violences aimed specifically against the local bureau of Italian industrial unions. And also, this is another thing which, so it is important to understand this specifically for the case of Naples. So Naples, especially after the Second World War, even before, had a strong factory economy, especially related to construction of military vessels, and it was a strong factory mentalities. They had strong unions in that historical moments. Right now, there are very few industries open in Naples, and just before the pandemic, Whirlpool, which is the big American industry, they just announced that they will shut down, and they have also said it again in the last days that they are going to shut down their last factory in Naples. That means hundreds and hundreds of people's unemployed, and so the increase of unemployment as well. So you see that there is an economic reason for this. There is certainly an economic crisis, an industrial crisis, um, which is in some way, yeah, the protest was also related to these economic factors. But I believe that it's very difficult to say or to assess whether in such a big crowd composed by many different elements, economic sides of the pandemic has played a bigger role of compared to other position. So for instance, especially in the South, and it's sad to say, but people feel that growing disaffection toward the central government. So I remember before the pandemic, before the first lockdown, there were some minor unrest in popular neighborhoods in Naples, where even very young kids, I'm talking about 12 years old, 14 years old kids, they throw stones to police cars. So the situation was already tense. The economic side has surely, the economic crisis related to the pandemic has surely influenced the actual unrest. But the thing is, I'm not completely sure that all the people that were there were affected economically by the pandemic. Don't need to forget that even if some low-level criminals, but there were also some criminals there.
Yeah, let's actually, that was basically, it's a good segue to my following two questions, because I was interested in starting to picking up, start to unpick the composition of the crowd. And as you said, there were peaceful protesters, there were violent protesters, there were shopkeepers and youth and people directly involved in the lockdown measures and in the economic crisis that follows that. But what about local organized crime? So did local organized crime have any role in these protests or not? That would be very interesting to see.
Trigger alert, because you know what I think about it. No, no, the thing is, you know, Andrea, it's very difficult to assess. So first of all, it depends how you define or what people believe when they ask about the role of organized crime in the protests, in the unrest. So if some people think that there was an obscure, in this case, since we were in Naples, Camorra boss um, actually maneuvering the oppressor, the revolt, so that thing is not there. So that is not, there is not this sort of criminal mastermind beyond the protest. And for what are my data from the ground, the people I spoke to, uh, there were some low-level fixer. So I'm talking about, you know, the classic kid who is selling some weed at the stadium on Sunday. I'm talking about this kind of criminals. But the big bosses or the big minds of the Camorra, they were not in the street. And these led me to two considerations that I would like to pose here. So the first one is that, especially when we talk about Italy, people think that they have this sort of timeless conception of mafia, right? So they don't see if the mafia is on the rise, is in fall, or whatever. So at the moment, I think, and I dare in saying that this is a very complicated moment for the Camorra in Naples. If you think about the big families of the 80s, like Cutolo, Nuvoletta, Di Lauro, De Giuliano, that were the bosses of cigarette smuggling, they say we are the Fiat of Naples. So they were very wealthy. The Mozzarella, all these people have been metaphorically beheaded by law enforcement. Many of them are on trials. A lot of them are in prison. So the big clans are not there. They are not at that strong um, governmentality, that strong capacity in ruling on the ground. Second of all, because I think that some people don't understand what James Cocaine called the strategic logic of organized crime. I quoted this book in my blog post for Word on the Street. So the mafia work as a sort of intermediate, or it occupies a role of interposition between the state and the people. So that means that they have not a strategic interest in unrest. What they are achieving, and I still believe that that's the truth, what they are trying to achieve is to invest a lot in the economic reconstruction after the pandemic. So when we finally will find a vaccine and our life will go back to normal, they will try to enter in that situation, especially because they are weak. They have a lot of money hiding at the moment, and they are waiting to reinvest that money in the aftermath of the pandemic. If you think that some newspapers, they have claimed that the Camorra was in the streets, but for now, the only source we have of this presence is the one of Giorgio Mascitelli, whose family lost a Camorra war in 2016 for the control of drug dealing in the neighbor of Ponticelli, Naples, so in the eastern part of the city. And what we have seen through the video, it was not Mascitelli taking on the police, but he was speaking with policemen over there, saying, we have nothing to do with this. We are here with the shopkeepers. We are not interested in harming you guys. So I know that there are many different perspectives on the role of the Camorra. I know some people really believe that the Camorra is in some ways leading this kind of protest. But what I see from that kind of video is an interposition role, is someone who's trying to cooling down the situation. So the old criminals, the criminals that I was talking before, they are just the low-level fixers, which are part of a supply chain led by the Camorra, especially on drug trafficking, cigarette smuggling, all that stuff. But they are not the Camorra, you know, as people believe that. So you do have what in Italian what we call the cani sciolti. So people with not tied affiliation to a clan or to a criminal organization, but which use violence or they are involved in crimes as a way to earn their life. But that's the level of involvement of organized crime at the moment in the actual arrest. And this is my view on this.
But that's very interesting. Like, it seems to me, first, it makes sense that it's the low-level fixers that would protest because they are the ones most impacted by these measures. Because, of course, when you have a lockdown and no one's on the streets, of course, it's much more difficult to deal in illegal drugs. So from one point of view, it makes a lot of sense. But it would seem that, of course, there's a very popular idea about mafias in general and Italian mafias in particular having some sort of criminal mastermind kind of figure that from the shadows governs what actually happens. It kind of borders on the conspiracy theory sometimes, but it seems to me that there is no mastermind because, there is no mastermind because they have been hunted down by the police in the past years and decades. And also, there is no even if the mastermind was there, it would be very difficult for him or her to actually manage the disorder and the role of organized crime in these protests, which is probably, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, which is probably why you end up seeing these low-level fixers. The fact that these low-level fixers are there is not a sign of like active, orderly involvement of the mafias, but it's actually a sign that the Camorra in this case has very little control on what their lower level affiliates, so to speak, do.
This is an interesting thing. Of course, you need to remind the peculiarity of the Camorra is to have this very loose structural configuration, okay? So it might be they are powerless. I take that, and but it's also related to the fact that if you talk to the big bosses, like think for instance of Cutolo, think about the others, what they have was a strong hardcore network of very few people, which has strong and very tight relations with the boss. But all the other people, like all the soldiers, they have always some sort of autonomy. Well, not that much in the case of Cudolo, but in the case of the Nuvoletta and also the Di Lauro in some ways, they let a certain degree of autonomy to the low-level fixers. So historically, the Camorra is the mafia with most loose configuration in comparison to Cosa Nostra or the 'Ndrangheta or other criminal organization across the decades and across the country. The thing is, it is an interesting thing, and maybe this is an argument for scholars to analyze in depth, a topic for scholars, sorry, to analyze in depth. The reason is that probably Camorra bosses, especially now that, as I said, it's a period of weakness for the criminal organization, they have not the strength or the ability to control tightly all the single low-level fixers at their disposal. Or maybe they just want to let these people do some damages around to reinforce their interposition role. And so to demonstrate that they are the one they need to talk to in order to guarantee at least a minimal level of security for their communities. So, as you said, it's very difficult to understand what's the reason of this loose configuration and why they are allowing people to commit this kind of acts. But I believe that, it's very much as you know this better than me, it's very much as organized crime in Brazil. So of course in Brazil you do have the big gangs, the Comando Vermelho, the all these people. But at the same time, you do have what the Marxists call the so-called lumpen proletariat. So very poor people who use their skills in violence and they use their skills in crime in general in order to earn a living. And it is very difficult to understand, especially when you analyze the dynamics of mass protest. Who was there? The lumpen proletariat or someone sent by the Camorra? I believe that the was more a popular base related to a lot of economic weaknesses in the economic system of the South, as I told you before, the street-based model of economic development. But I don't see at this moment the ability by a criminal organization, nor even the will by a criminal organization, the Camorra or whoever, to control and to unleash this kind of mass protest. We do need to pose restriction. We do need to wear masks to save lives. But at the same time, the Camorra, to me, and it's a paradox, is secretly hoping for this sort of lockdown measures because in the long term, they represent a very, very good business opportunity for them.
Sure, I understand. It's kind of sad that it seems to me that the Camorra and perhaps other mafias in Italy as well, they stand to gain from this situation kind of like anyhow, like in whatever the evolution of the current situation. So if lockdown happens, that means larger economic gains later. And if the low-level fixers participate, they stand to gain because they still kind of they can reimpose their interposition role, as you mentioned. And another sad thing is, as you're right, I mean, in Brazil, there is this kind of lumpen proletariat of crime, which is also of course, it's also the people who are most apparent, which I guess it's the case in Naples as well. And
the favelados.
Sorry?
The favelados.
Exactly. Yeah. And basically, yeah, these are like the ones who are there just to gain some money, and they have very little other opportunities. Of course, there's a lot of people in the favelas and elsewhere that still choose, of course, to gain to earn money honestly, but then a few of them end up being co-opted in that criminal life. And there is this, to be fair, the popular idea of the criminal mastermind is not only present abroad when people think about the Italian mafias, but it's also present in the media and in citizens of Italy and Brazil. It's very tempting to think that there is one criminal mastermind that gives orders from the shadows, from the prisons, from some kind of hidden place, and everything is explainable through this criminal boss. And reality is actually much more complex than that. And I wanted to...
Yeah, much more complex. I think, sorry if I interrupt you, but there is a thing that just came out to my mind that to describe the mafia strategy in relation to the pandemic. I remember of this quote from a Taliban fighter who said to a CIA agent he said, "You guys have watches, but we have time." And this is very much the kind of approach that they are having right now. Like, we don't care. We're not going to starve. We can wait. We can wait other 6 months of lockdown, even if we're going to waste some money because, drug dealing stop and counterfeit products stop and cigarette smuggling stop during a lockdown, a strong lockdown, a real lockdown. But I believe that, in the long run, unfortunately, they have time. And we have just watches at this moment.
Wow. That's a really cool quote, man. Like, thanks for bringing that in.
I know. I remember. I just remember. I don't remember where I read it.
Well, it's very
I
striking.
will find the book at some point.
Yeah, well, or if someone in the audience knows the source of that, just leave it in the comments. Like, welcome to YouTube. Just a brief. I wanted you to, before we go maybe into the research-related insights of this whole discussion, I wanted maybe you to have like a short comment on the more political protesters, because as you said, these protests didn't seem to have much participation from the far left. But there were some protesters from the far right. So what do you make of that? Like, was the role important? Was that a plan that they had to participate in these protests once a second lockdown arrived? Or do you think that was just a kind of a decision to take part of it, who was taken in the moment just to be there and to be seen at these protests?
That's a really interesting question. I believe that at least in these historical contexts, the configuration, the structure of the Camorra, as well as the far left and the far right, are very similar. So, you know, it's very much similar to the militias in the US, right? We talk a lot about far right extremists, but who is the boss of the far right extremists, right? Who is the bin Laden of the far left? Who is the al-Baghdadi of the far right? So the thing is, yes, I do believe that they are affected negatively by some things that happened, especially during the first lockdown. So during the first lockdown, especially after the EU signed a deal for you know, the next generation and the economic funding of the EU member states to face the economic crisis after the pandemic, was a real blow for them. And so they lose the kind of narrative because they can blame, they can use plot theories in order to reinforce their views and in order to gain a sort of of um, of uh, of control, well, not of control, but to gain a sort of legitimacy toward, you know, common people. And the idea of showing or of going in the streets and clashing with the police was definitely something they want to do, to say we are here, we are alive, and also to give or to scare in some ways the government. I do remember that we heard a lot of the potential risks related to organized crime in the context of the pandemics, but I've seen that the Italian government, when they saw far right and far left, also in the rich cities like Turin or Milan, richer in comparison to Naples or any other city of the south, they start to understand that this is a serious thing. And what they fear right now, it's a sort of alliance between these very, very varied extremisms in Italy. So when you can have a sort of link between the organized crime, the political extremism, and the hooligans and all these kind of things, I'm quite skeptic about a sort of alliance, sorry, between all these different extremisms. But that's the scenario that is circulating right now in the government bureaus. And this is something that is going to happen. The thing is, they need to capitalize now, because if, as it probably will happen, the EU will reach definitely a deal under the new rules, which are the one that EU financing for economic crisis is strictly linked for the first time in the history of the EU to the respect of the rule of law, which is something that is going to affect especially countries in the eastern of Europe. So I'm talking about Poland, Hungary. If that thing passed, it's going to be a bad time, especially for the far right, also for the far left, but mainly for the far right. And so they need to gain the moment now, because otherwise it will be too late for them. This is my analysis on their involvement at this point. Reminding also, or always bearing in mind the fact that right now you do have far right leaders who try to in some ways co-opt the protest, say we were there, we were the ones fighting against the a government, against a regime, against whatever, a dictatorship, however you want to call it. But there is no one clear leader on the far right and on the far left of the oppressed, at least now.
Which I guess it's, from one point of view, positive, because like a charismatic leader would really push like a protest movement, even from the political extremes, to success. But it's also negative because it's very difficult to understand who's leading. So we're like facing a more networked, loose kind of structure of political extremist movements that are taking part in these protests.
Exactly. And it is even more difficult for these kind of movements to actually obtain a political gain, because it is difficult, if not even impossible, to have some sort of negotiations between a loose movement on the one hand and a state, so a hierarchical political subject on the other. This is something that is characterizing modern violence a lot, especially in comparison also to terrorism, drug cartels, and all this kind of stuff.
Well, I think this is a good segue to my final question, which is, well, we've talked about a lot of things in these interviews so far. What are the impact of the events in Naples, and if you want, in Italy in general, of these unrest that we have seen and that we have discussed? What are the impacts on research, especially research about, of course, urban unrest, protests, and even urban warfare?
Well, in the case of Italy, I found three interesting points concerning tactical, from the tactical perspective of these movements, of these arrests. So the first one is that I see a greater ability by these kind of movements to, what I say, to read the polls. So to be able in capitalizing social legitimacy. And it's a sad thing to say, but they have been able, even more able than us, scholars or politicians, to understand the grief, and to understand the grievances, and to understand the critics that a part of the population is having toward the official government. The second thing, very practical, that I found quite interesting is that, at least to my knowledge of the subject, I never seen such a use of social media so efficient in coordinating the effort. So I remember having this Telegram, seeing these Telegrams group, Facebook groups with people saying, tonight, here, at that time, let's go after the police. Let's take on the police. And this is something that it is something that has already happened globally. So I think, for example, in the 2008 Mumbai attacks, when you do have phones, people use cell phones and to direct the cells. And the use of these specific use of social media, especially Telegram, it's really, really interesting, because the bulk of our knowledge on this use of social media is related mainly to the US or to Islamist terrorism, but there is something related also strictly to urban violence and strictly to this kind of operations that is coming on. The second thing is, I believe that these unrest represent a challenge to what I call the Le Bon perspective on popular unrest. Gustave Le Bon, in The Crowd, his most famous book, he used to say that crowds and mobs are basically brainless or even stupid. So Le Bon said a thing that was really funny. He said, if you take the smartest academic and put him in the middle of a crowd, it will become the most stupid person in the world. And this is something that is not completely true to me. What the unrests are showing to us is that these groups, despite their loose configuration, despite a lot of problems that they have from a hierarchical perspective, they are able to capitalize a strong level of intelligence, because they know their territory better of the law enforcement. So if you think, for example, of a city of Naples, which is basically made of very narrow alleys and very big spaces, it was impressive to see how these people were able to to confront the police and then disappear. And you have this perception of the fact that they know their streets better. And this is a symptom or a sign of this sort of tactical or strategic wise attitude by these groups. So I do believe, I think that in the future we have to challenge the conception of the mob, of the mass, are something inherently stupid or brainless. But they have a sort of strategic wisdom. They have a sort of strategic knowledge of the terrain that they are able to employ. And for what concerns the future, well, my general idea is that, first of all, we should never fail, and we should never try to use preconceived approaches in order to make sense of this sort of arrest. So you can't analyze what happens in Naples with the same framework you have used to analyze militias in the US or mass demonstration in Iraq or in Mali. The second thing, which is the most interesting for me, it's very difficult. So as you know, we scholars focus on urban violence. We always said, and we always warn political authorities of the fact that our age will be increasingly characterized by mass demonstration. And I do believe that we are in the age of mass protest. We are in the middle. Like, think from Arab Springs, revolts in Mali, Burkina Faso, and then you have Chile, and then you have... So we are in the middle of the age of mass contestations and mass protest. To understand this contestation and mass protest, it is important to, I know it's something strong to say, but to go back to a more qualitative approach and multidisciplinary approach. So as we have as we did in our talk here today, to understand the unrest in Naples, you need to put together economic factors, historical factor, politics and policies as factors. You need to put together all these things. So in the future, to understand mass arrest, we need to go back to a multidisciplinary qualitative approach. Quantitative colleagues, quantitative approach, they gave us in the last years a lot of data. Now we need to have this multidisciplinary approach to make proper sense of this. And my final remark on this would be that I believe, as I told you, that we have entered in the age of mass protest. And I believe that the age of mass protest, it's also the restart or the return of the age of mass politics. We have seen in the last United States elections that the results have been influenced by mass movements who went door to door to record people to vote, mailing votes, crowds, queues. We have seen all these things. And I believe that what we need to be careful about is to realize, at least for me, up to date, how the return of mass protest or the age of mass protest can be also the return of mass politics, and so of collective politics. And this is something interesting to watch in the forthcoming years for me.
It's very interesting. And I personally would agree with everything you said, although I'm a qualitative researcher, so I may be a little biased on the need for...
No. I want to be clear on this, because I do believe I do believe the quantitative people have done a lot in the last years. But as Feli Alum recently wrote, and she's an expert on, one of the world experts in the Camorra, she said, we do have a lot of data now, thanks to our quantitative colleagues. But now we need to find a sense to all these numbers. And this is the thing. I'm not one of the partisans of qualitative versus quantitative or the opposite. I just believe that the two things are needed at the same time.
Sure, they need to work together, because
exactly.
Like the divide between qualitative and quantitative research doesn't make any sense. We need all the data and different kinds of analysis that we can, because reality is so complex that we can't really afford to really forget about, such important parts of academia. Listening to you, I thought that maybe this could be, I agree with this idea of, and I actually find it very interesting. And I think there's going to be a lot of people in our audience who are going to find this interesting, not only for the focus on organized crime, but especially for protests. Our first episode was about Chile and, of course, the massive protest movement that happened there. When you mentioned Telegram, I thought about Catalonia and Hong Kong that both used Telegram, even in different ways. In Catalonia, there was a very popular, which I think it had more than 200,000 followers, like a Telegram channel called Anonymous Catalonia. And in Hong Kong, Telegram was used because it wasn't, basically it wasn't impacted by the security forces apparatus of Hong Kong and of mainland China. Could we say that this is the age of the smart crowds? I know smart is a very inflation term, and it's kind of a buzzword. And maybe crowds have always been smart, but it has been very difficult to understand that because it's very difficult to make research with a mob, I guess. But maybe social media, and we have seen that for a few years, are making crowds really smart, and they're making very, very quick, very easy to assemble them. And it's very easy for them to coordinate and to, as you said, use local terrain. So this is what we're seeing now, and it's even making easy for them to coordinate across cities and across countries, provided that they have, of course, the cultural tools that they can go beyond the language barrier. So maybe what we're seeing is maybe crowds have always been smart, but they're getting even smarter thanks to the tools that they have at their disposal right now.
That's a very, very good point. I believe that it really depends on when you define smart, right? So it really depends if you think smart in a political way or in a Machiavellian way. So they are able to use their political weight at the highest level of efficiency. Not completely sure about it. So if you think, for instance, the loose configuration of terrorism and the loose configuration of drug cartels in Mexico, they did produce a lot of violence, but they weren't that much able to produce policy outcomes, right? Not always able to produce policy outcomes. And, but definitely they are smart, and they are smart, I believe, in two ways. So the first one is, of course, as I said before, their ability to read terrain, their ability to read the human geography on the area where they gather or in the area where they live. Because, for instance, I saw in Naples, I saw also recently in Reggio Calabria, where there were some minor arrests as well. I've seen their ability to read better the terrain in comparison to law enforcement. I see a sort of a smart attitude towards propaganda and towards the ability to understand not only how or where, but when to act. But at the same time, I don't know if we consider it, that's why I use the term wise, because when you're wise, you're not necessarily smart, but you definitely know something. And at this moment, I see that they are at least tactically wise. We will see if social media will give the opportunity to become also politically smart and strategically smart. But I think it's something that we need to watch in the coming years. At the moment, I see a very smart attitude concerning tactics, but there is always need to be a political mastermind. If you think about the militias in the US, to have a political weight, they need to wait for a president who has this sort of benevolence or ambiguity toward their behaviors and their belief. But of course, they are wise. They are able to read the geography and to read the humor of the population, sometimes even better than we scholars do. That's sad, but it's true.
Unfortunately, it is, yeah. But thank you for unpicking the word smart, because I think it was really, really needed. I threw this buzzword at you, and I think you did a really good job at, well, picking apart the different aspects of it. And it's really just this collective action problem that we're still trying to deal with, I guess, like tens of thousands of years after the start of any sizable human society. How do people come together and achieve results together? I guess crowds now manage to achieve some goals more easily and to congregate more easily, but then some things they're still struggling with. So it's going to be interesting how that changes in the future. So I think thank you so much for everything you said. This was a
thank you for having me. It has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
It has been a pleasure for me as well. So go check Luciano Pollichieni, go check his research. Go check the article that he wrote, the blog post that he wrote for us back in May about the pandemic and the role of mafias in Italy. Please subscribe to our channel to get more episodes about street talk. We'll continue to produce them in the future. So, and with the lockdowns everywhere, I guess it's going to be even more the case. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you at the next episode.